I'm William, 65 years old, a retired construction engineer with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that have seen both joy and heartbreak. After 25 years of marriage, Margaret and I divorced 15 years ago. Last month, I received the news that she had passed away suddenly from health complications. Then came a notice from a lawyer about the reading of her will. My son James told me I would get nothing from her $35 million estate. But what happened in that lawyer's office changed everything. If you are watching from a place where family bonds were once strong but now broken, hit that like and subscribe button so we can navigate this emotional journey together. Your support means the world to me during these challenging times. The year was 1980, and I was attending an industry fair in Boston representing my construction firm. That's when I first saw Margaret. She stood confidently at a small booth showcasing her fledgling tech startup, her auburn hair catching the light, her green eyes sparkling with intelligence and ambition. While most people passed by her modest display, I was immediately drawn to her passion as she explained her vision for streamlining construction project management through software. "You actually understand what I'm talking about," she said with surprise after I asked several technical questions. "Most people just nod and walk away." "Well, I deal with these challenges every day," I replied. "Your solution could save companies like mine thousands of hours and millions of dollars." I asked her to dinner that evening to continue our conversation. What was meant to be a professional discussion quickly evolved into something more personal. Margaret was not only brilliant, but funny, warm, and surprisingly vulnerable when she shared her struggles as a woman trying to break into the male-dominated tech industry. "Everyone expects me to fail," she confided over dessert. "My own father told me to get a secretarial job instead of wasting money on this company." "Their underestimation is your advantage," I told her. "They won't see you coming until you've already succeeded." Our connection was immediate and powerful. We lived in different cities, but I found myself making excuses to visit Boston frequently. We spoke on the phone for hours each night, racking up phone bills that made me wince, but I never regretted. Within 6 months, I had transferred to a Boston office to be closer to her. After a year of dating, I proposed on the harbor at sunset, and Margaret accepted without hesitation. The early years of our marriage were blissful. We purchased a modest home in a suburb outside Boston, and I threw myself into helping Margaret build her company. Evenings and weekends were spent around our dining table, reviewing business plans, financial projections, and marketing strategies. I believed in her vision completely and used my industry connections to help her secure her first major clients. In 1985, our son James was born. I still remember holding him in the hospital, his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, while Margaret watched us with tired but happy eyes. "We made something perfect," she whispered. "You did all the hard work," I replied, kissing her forehead. "No, William, we're a team. I couldn't have gotten here without you," she said, gesturing to both the baby and the flowers from her employees that filled the hospital room. Those words meant everything to me then. As James grew, so did Margaret's company. The tech boom of the 90s catapulted her business from a promising startup to a major player in construction management software. By 1995, her company had 50 employees. By 2000, over 200 with offices in 3 cities and a valuation in the millions. Meanwhile, I continued my work as a construction engineer. My income was modest but stable. As Margaret's career demanded more travel and longer hours, I adjusted my schedule to be more present for James. I became the parent who attended school events, helped with homework, and made dinner most nights. I turned down promotions that would have required travel or longer hours, knowing our family needed at least one parent consistently present. "Daddy, why don't you have a big office like Mommy?" James asked me once after visiting Margaret's impressive headquarters. "Because my most important job is being your dad," I answered truthfully. It was a choice I never regretted, even as the income gap between Margaret and me grew exponentially. I renovated our house myself, creating a home office for Margaret so she could spend more time with us when not traveling. I maintained our investment properties, managed our household finances, and ensured James had everything he needed to thrive. In many ways, I became both mother and father to him during his formative years. Around 2000, I began noticing subtle changes in our relationship. Margaret was increasingly absent, not just physically but emotionally. Conversations that once flowed easily became perfunctory exchanges about schedules and logistics. Date nights became rare, then non-existent. When I expressed concern, Margaret blamed the pressures of running a growing company. "This is what success looks like, William," she would say. "We're providing a wonderful life for James. Isn't that what matters most?" I tried to be understanding. I arranged romantic getaways only to have her cancel at the last minute due to unavoidable business emergencies. I suggested marriage counseling, but Margaret insisted we didn't have problems that warranted professional intervention. "We're just in a busy season," became her mantra. But seasons changed, years passed, and the distance between us only grew. Still, I remained optimistic. I told myself that once the company reached a certain level of stability, once James was older, once the next product launch was complete, Margaret would reconnect with our family. I held on to the memory of the woman who had once told me we were a team, believing that foundation was strong enough to weather any temporary storm. How wrong I was. The morning Margaret asked for a divorce remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. It was a Sunday in April 2010. James was 25 and had recently joined his mother's company after completing his business degree. I had made breakfast as usual and was looking forward to a rare day with my wife who had promised to set work aside. Instead, she came downstairs dressed in business attire, her face a mask of determination. "William, we need to talk," she said, not touching the coffee I had poured her. "This isn't working anymore. I want a divorce." The words hit me like a physical blow. Despite the growing distance between us, I had never seriously considered that our marriage might end. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling, take a vacation together, reconnect." Margaret shook her head. "It's too late for that. I haven't been in love with you for years. We've grown in different directions. You must have felt it too." But I hadn't. Or perhaps I had refused to acknowledge it, clinging to the hope that we would eventually find our way back to each other. "Is there someone else?" I asked, the question burning in my throat. Her momentary hesitation told me everything before she even spoke. "Robert Davies invested in the company last year. We've become close. It's not the reason for the divorce, but yes, we have developed feelings for each other." Robert Davies. I had met him several times at company functions, a venture capitalist with a sleek manner and expensive suits. I thought of the late-night calls Margaret had been taking in her home office, the weekend emergency meetings that had become increasingly frequent. "How long?" I managed to ask. "Does it matter?" The important thing is to make this transition as smooth as possible, especially for James. In the days that followed, I learned that Margaret had been planning this for months. She had already consulted with attorneys, had financial documents prepared, and even looked into housing options for me. The methodical nature of her exit from our marriage was perhaps the most painful aspect, evidence that this was not a rash decision, but a calculated business move. When I told James about the divorce, hoping for support, or at least understanding, I was met with unexpected hostility. "Mom told me you two have been unhappy for years," he said. "She stayed to give me a stable home until I was established. You should be grateful she didn't leave sooner." I was stunned by his response and the realization that Margaret had been shaping our son's perception of our marriage and my role in it. The two people I loved most had been having conversations about the failure of my marriage without me creating a narrative in which I was either an obstacle or an afterthought. The divorce proceedings quickly became contentious. Margaret hired a team of top divorce attorneys from a prestigious Boston firm, while I struggled to find adequate representation with my limited resources. Eventually, I found Thomas, a young but dedicated lawyer who took my case despite the obvious imbalance of power. "They're going to try to minimize your contributions to the marriage and her success," Thomas warned me during our first meeting. "We need to document everything you've done to support her career and raise your son." I spent weeks gathering evidence of my contributions over our 25-year marriage, from financial investments in Margaret's early business to the career opportunities I had sacrificed to support her ambitions and care for our son. I had naively believed that Margaret would acknowledge these sacrifices, that despite wanting to end our marriage, she would be fair about the partnership we had built together. Instead, her legal team painted me as a financial burden who had benefited from Margaret's success while contributing little of value. They argued that my career stagnation was due to lack of ambition rather than family prioritization. They even suggested that Margaret had succeeded despite me, not because of my support. During one particularly brutal deposition, Margaret's lawyer questioned me about my income over the years compared to Margaret's. So while your wife was building a multi-million-dollar company, you remained in the same middle management position for over a decade, is that correct? He asked with thinly veiled contempt. I remained in that position to be available for our son and to manage our household while my wife traveled extensively for business, I replied. But you didn't have to make that choice, did you? No one forced you to limit your career advancement. We made those decisions together as a family, I insisted. The lawyer smirked. Yet, Ms. Harrington has no recollection of asking you to sacrifice your career. In fact, she states she encouraged you repeatedly to pursue advancement opportunities. Throughout this ordeal, my health suffered. I lost weight, developed insomnia, and started experiencing panic attacks for the first time in my life. Thomas became concerned enough to suggest I see a doctor who prescribed anti-anxiety medication just so I could function through the divorce proceedings. The most painful aspect was James's complete alignment with his mother. He testified on her behalf, stating that I had been an emotionally distant father who showed little interest in his accomplishments. This rewriting of our history broke something fundamental in me. The countless baseball games I had coached, the school projects I had helped with late into the night, the emotional support I had provided during his adolescent struggles, all erased in service of his mother's narrative. After 18 months of legal battles, the divorce was finalized. The settlement granted me our family home, which was worth approximately $800,000, and a cash payment of $500,000. Margaret retained full ownership of her company, then valued at around $15 million, as well as our vacation properties and the majority of our investment accounts. Thomas told me I was lucky to get what I did. Given the prenuptial agreement and the way the judge was leaning, this is actually better than I expected. But it didn't feel lucky. It felt like being erased from my own life story. 25 years reduced to a payout that represented a fraction of what we had built together. And worse than the financial settlement was the loss of my relationship with James, who made it clear he saw me as the villain in his parents' story. As I signed the final papers, Margaret avoided my eyes. "I hope you find happiness, William," she said formally, as if speaking to a distant acquaintance. "I hope it was worth it," I replied, referring to more than just the money. At 50 years old, I found myself starting over. The house that had once been filled with family memories now echoed with emptiness. Friends we had shared as a couple gradually drifted away, most choosing to maintain their relationship with Margaret, whose social and professional capital far outweighed mine. I returned to full-time work at a new construction firm, throwing myself into my projects to fill the void left by my collapsed family life. The routine of work provided structure when everything else felt chaotic, but evenings and weekends stretched before me like deserts of time. During those first months, I made countless attempts to connect with James. I called, texted, and emailed regularly, only to be met with brief perfunctory responses or silence. I sent birthday and Christmas gifts, which were acknowledged with terse thank you notes that felt obligatory rather than genuine. "James, I know things are difficult right now," I said during one rare phone conversation, "but I hope we can rebuild our relationship. Nothing is more important to me than being your father." "I'm really busy with the company right now," he replied. "Maybe we can talk about this later." Later never seemed to come. When I suggested meeting for dinner or coffee, he always had a work commitment or travel plans that made it impossible. On the few occasions we did meet, usually at his reluctant agreement, after multiple requests from me, the conversation was strained and superficial. Depression settled over me like a heavy fog. My doctor increased my medication and suggested therapy, which I finally agreed to after waking up one Sunday morning, unable to think of a single reason to get out of bed. Dr. Patricia Lewis, my therapist, became a lifeline during those dark days. She helped me process the grief of losing both my marriage and my relationship with my son, and she challenged me to envision a future beyond those losses. "William, you've defined yourself as a husband and father for so long," she observed during one session. "Now you need to rediscover who you are outside those roles." It was through therapy that I began to reconnect with interests and passions I had set aside during my marriage. I had always enjoyed woodworking, but rarely had time for it while balancing work and family responsibilities. Now, I converted part of my garage into a workshop and began creating furniture. The focus required for precise measurements and cuts provided respite from ruminating thoughts, and the tangible results gave me a sense of accomplishment I had been missing. Dr. Lewis also encouraged me to expand my social circle. Isolation feeds depression, she warned. You need community. Acting on her advice, I volunteered with Habitat for Humanity using my construction skills to help build homes for families in need. The physical labor was therapeutic, and for the first time in months, I felt useful. It was through this volunteer work that I met Frank Sullivan, a retired architect who had also gone through a difficult divorce late in life. Frank's friendship proved invaluable. He understood my situation in a way others couldn't, and his own journey from devastation to rebuilding gave me hope for my future. We began meeting weekly for breakfast conversations that ranged from construction techniques to the challenges of dating in our 50s to the grief of estrangement from adult children. My daughter didn't speak to me for 3 years after my divorce, Frank shared one morning. Now she's planning her wedding and wants me to walk her down the aisle. Time changes things, William. Don't give up on James. Encouraged by Frank's experience, I continued reaching out to James despite his constant rebuffs. I sent emails sharing memories from his childhood articles I thought might interest him and updates on my life without expecting responses. I attended his MBA graduation ceremony sitting in the back and not approaching him when I saw he was surrounded by his mother's friends and colleagues. From a distance, I followed James's rising career at his mother's company. The business press occasionally featured him as a young executive to watch, and Margaret's company social media proudly highlighted his accomplishments. In one interview, he credited his mother as his sole mentor and inspiration, making no mention of my existence. Reading those words, I felt as if I had been completely erased from his life narrative. After 5 years of consistent effort with minimal reciprocation, I made one final attempt to reconnect at a significant moment. James had just been promoted to vice president at Margaret's company, and I sent a handwritten congratulatory letter with a vintage compass that had belonged to my father. "Your grandfather gave this to me when I started my career," I wrote. "He said it would help me find my way when the path wasn't clear. I hope it might serve the same purpose for you. I'm incredibly proud of the man you've become, even if I've had the privilege of watching from a distance rather than up close." 2 weeks later, the package was returned unopened with "Return to Sender" written across it in James's handwriting. That night, I sat in my workshop until dawn, the rejected compass in my hand, finally accepting that some bridges cannot be rebuilt if one person keeps dismantling their end. With tremendous pain, but also a sense of necessity, I decided to respect James's clear wish for distance. "You can't force someone to want you in their life," Frank said when I shared my decision, "but you can leave the door open while living yours fully." And so I did. I expanded my volunteer work, joined a community theater group building sets, developed new friendships, and even began dating occasionally, though nothing serious developed. I created a life that had meaning and moments of joy, even as I carried the quiet grief of my son's absence. On a rainy Tuesday morning in September, I received the call that changed everything again. "Mr. Harrington, this is Dr. Patel from Boston Memorial Hospital. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your ex-wife, Margaret Harrington." The world seemed to stop as he explained that Margaret had suffered a massive stroke while at work. Despite efforts to save her, she had passed away without regaining consciousness. She was only 62. After thanking the doctor and hanging up, I sat motionless at my kitchen table, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Despite the bitterness of our divorce and the years of estrangement, Margaret had been my wife for 25 years, the mother of my child, my partner, through much of my adult life. Her sudden absence from the world left me feeling untethered, as if a reference point on my personal map had suddenly vanished. My first thought was of James. Whatever Margaret had done to me, she had remained close to our son. Her loss would be devastating for him. I dialed his number, uncertain if he would even accept my call. To my surprise, he answered on the third ring. "Dad." His voice was flat, controlled, but the fact that he called me Dad rather than William, as he had taken to doing in recent years, suggested his emotional defenses were compromised. "James, I just heard about your mother. I'm so sorry." A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of his breathing. "Thank you for calling," he finally said, his professional tone at odds with the circumstances. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. "Anything you need help with?" "No, everything is being handled." Another pause. "The funeral is Thursday at St. Andrew's, 2 o'clock. Would it be all right if I attended?" I asked carefully, unsure of my place in this ritual of mourning. "It's a public service," he replied, which wasn't quite an invitation but not a rejection either. James, regardless of what happened between your mother and me, I know how close you two were. This must be incredibly difficult for you. I have to go, he said abruptly. There are arrangements to make. The line went dead before I could respond. In the days before the funeral, I wrestled with whether I should attend. Would my presence be seen as intrusive or disrespectful? Would it cause James additional pain during an already difficult time? Yet the thought of not paying my final respects to someone who had been so central to my life, regardless of how things had ended, felt wrong. In the end, I decided to go, but to keep a low profile. I wore my best suit, drove to the imposing stone church where I had once attended Christmas services with Margaret and James, and slipped into a pew near the back just as the service was beginning. The church was filled to capacity, a testament to Margaret's professional success and social connections. The mourners were a sea of expensive suits and somber dresses. From my position, I could see James in the front row, his shoulders rigid, flanked by people I didn't recognize. The service was elegant and formal, much like Margaret herself had become in later years. Colleagues spoke of her business acumen, her mentorship, her philanthropic efforts. A cousin shared brief memories of her childhood. Not once was I mentioned nor our life together, as if those 25 years had been excised from her official biography. After the service, I hesitated at the edges of the reception in the church hall, feeling increasingly like an intruder. I was about to leave when James approached a young woman at his side. "You came," he said, his tone unreadable. "I needed to say goodbye," I replied simply. James nodded stiffly, then gestured to the woman beside him. "This is my wife, Stephanie. We got married last year." The news that my son had married without my knowledge was another small heartbreak, but I managed a genuine smile for my daughter-in-law. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Stephanie. I just wish it were under different circumstances." She offered a sympathetic smile that suggested she knew more about me than I had revealed in our brief interaction. "James has mentioned you," she said, which was more acknowledgement than I had expected. Before our awkward conversation could continue, James was called away by a group of executives, leaving Stephanie and me in an uncomfortable silence. "He's been under a lot of pressure," she offered after a moment. "Running the company, now this." "Running the company?" I repeated, surprised. "I thought he was vice president." "He was promoted to CEO 2 years ago when Margaret stepped back to focus on strategic initiatives," Stephanie explained, seeming surprised by my ignorance. "The company has grown tremendously under his leadership. It's valued at $35 million now." The figure stunned me. When Margaret and I divorced, the company had been worth $15 million, and I had thought that impressive. The growth under James's leadership was remarkable. Our conversation was interrupted by a distinguished older man who approached with purpose. "William Harrington," he inquired. "I'm Alexander Reed, Margaret's attorney. There's going to be a reading of the will at my office next Thursday at 2. Your presence is requested." He handed me a formal notification on heavy cardstock, nodded politely, and moved on before I could ask any questions. Stephanie looked as surprised as I felt. "I should get back to James," she said, touching my arm briefly. "Take care, William." As I drove home from the funeral, the lawyer's invitation puzzled me. Why would I be included in the reading of Margaret's will? Our divorce had been final for 15 years, and we had no financial ties remaining. Perhaps it was a mere formality, or perhaps Margaret had left some small memento to acknowledge our shared history. Either way, I decided I would attend, if only to bring final closure to this chapter of my life. 1 week after the funeral, I received an unexpected phone call from James. "Dad." He began the words, still sounding foreign on his lips after years of formality. "I was wondering if you might want to have dinner tonight, before the will reading tomorrow." Surprised but hopeful, I agreed immediately, suggesting a casual restaurant near my home. James countered with the name of an upscale steakhouse in downtown Boston. "Stephanie will be joining us," he added. 7 o'clock. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, nervous about this rare opportunity to spend time with my son. The maitre d' led me to a corner table where James and Stephanie were already seated, both dressed in business attire that made my sport coat and slacks feel inadequate. James stood as I approached, offering a handshake rather than an embrace. "Dad?" he acknowledged, then pulled out a chair for me across from them. Up close, I could see the toll grief had taken on him. His eyes were shadowed, his normally impeccable appearance slightly frayed at the edges. Yet he still carried himself with the confidence his mother had instilled in him, a young man certain of his place in the world. After ordering drinks and appetizers, James cleared his throat clearly, having prepared for this conversation. "I wanted to talk to you before tomorrow's meeting with the lawyers." He began, his tone businesslike. "I thought it might be helpful if you understood the situation clearly." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Mom's estate is quite substantial," he said, swirling the scotch in his glass. "The company alone is valued at $35 million, and there are other assets as well, personal investments, properties." "She was always brilliant with business," I acknowledged. "And from what Stephanie mentioned at the funeral, you've been instrumental in the company's recent growth. That's impressive, James. Truly." A flicker of surprise crossed his face at the compliment before his expression returned to careful neutrality. "Yes. Well, the company has been my life for the past decade, which brings me to why I wanted to meet tonight." He leaned forward slightly. "Dad, I need to be straightforward with you. Mom's will is going to be primarily focused on the company's future and securing her legacy. I don't want you to go into tomorrow with any expectations that might lead to disappointment." The implication was clear. "James, I'm not expecting anything from your mother's estate," I said quietly. "Our financial ties were severed long ago." "Good," he said with visible relief, "because the truth is, there won't be anything coming your way. Mom was very specific about her wishes." Stephanie placed a hand on his arm, a gentle restraint. "James," she murmured, a note of caution in her voice. He softened his approach slightly. "I'm just trying to be honest to avoid any awkwardness tomorrow. The company is moving into an exciting new phase, and Mom wanted to ensure a smooth transition. She left very detailed instructions about the distribution of her assets." The conversation continued in this vein throughout dinner, with James subtly but consistently emphasizing that I should not expect to benefit from Margaret's estate. Beneath his polished exterior, I sensed anxiety, as if he feared I might somehow threaten his inheritance or position. "The lawyer who contacted you, Alexander Reed, has been Mom's personal attorney for 20 years, James explained as we waited for dessert. "He's very thorough, very detail-oriented. The reading itself is mostly a formality since the documents are quite clear." "I understand," I assured him again. "I'm attending out of respect, nothing more." As we parted outside the restaurant, James shook my hand again, his grip firmer this time. "See you tomorrow, Dad," he said, and for a moment I glimpsed vulnerability beneath his corporate armor. Despite everything, he was still a son who had lost his mother navigating grief while trying to maintain control. Driving home, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Hurt that James thought I would try to claim part of Margaret's estate, sadness at the wall of formality between us, but also a small spark of hope that this dinner, however awkward, might be a first step toward healing our relationship. Yet his warnings left me with an uneasy feeling. Why was he so concerned about my expectations? Was there something in Margaret's will that he feared might complicate his plans? Or was this simply the caution of a man who had been raised to view business and family as inseparable concerns? With these questions circling in my mind, I prepared myself for whatever the next day might bring, expecting nothing but closure, yet unable to shake the feeling that something unexpected awaited in that lawyer's office. The following afternoon, I arrived at the imposing glass and steel building that housed Reed & Associates legal firm. The receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 32nd floor, where several people were already gathered around a long mahogany table. James sat at the far end, Stephanie beside him, both engaged in quiet conversation with a silver-haired man I assumed was Alexander Reed. Several others occupied chairs along the sides, faces I vaguely recognized from Margaret's company or the funeral. Near Reed sat a younger attorney with an open laptop and stacks of documents. James glanced up as I entered, acknowledging me with a nod but not interrupting his discussion with Reed. I took a seat halfway down the table, feeling conspicuously out of place among these polished business associates. At precisely 2 o'clock, Reed stood and called the meeting to order. He was tall and distinguished, with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to managing both wealth and the emotions that often surround it. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "We are gathered to address the last will and testament of Margaret Eleanor Harrington. Before we proceed, I want to clarify that everyone in this room has been specifically named in the will or represents someone who has been named." His eyes swept the table, pausing briefly on me before continuing. Margaret was meticulous in her planning, as those who knew her would expect. "The documents we'll review today were prepared with great care and updated regularly throughout her life." Reed proceeded to outline the basic structure of Margaret's estate before addressing specific bequests. As James had indicated, the bulk of her assets were connected to her technology company Harrington Systems, now a leader in construction management software. To James William Harrington, her son, Reed read from the formal document, Margaret leaves 60% ownership of Harrington Systems, ensuring controlling interest along with the primary residence in Beacon Hill, all associated furnishings, her personal investment portfolio, and liquid assets totaling approximately $3.2 million. James's expression remained neutral, as if he had expected exactly this. Reed continued through the will, detailing smaller bequests to various employees, relatives, and charities. Margaret's sister received a vacation property in Vermont. Her longtime assistant was granted a generous cash gift and a small percentage of company shares. A significant donation was made to the Women in Technology Scholarship Fund Margaret had established years earlier. Throughout the reading, I sat quietly, neither expecting nor wanting anything. My presence felt increasingly unnecessary, merely a courtesy on Reed's part. I was considering how to discreetly exit once the formal proceedings concluded when Reed cleared his throat and picked up a separate document. Now we come to a codicil added to the will 3 months before Margaret's passing, he announced, his tone shifting slightly. This addition was made after her annual physical revealed the risk factors that ultimately led to her stroke, though she shared this health information with very few people. The room grew quieter, several people leaning forward with increased interest. James frowned slightly, his posture tensing. In this codicil, Reed continued, Margaret made one significant addition to her will that affects the distribution previously outlined. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked directly at the document. To William Thomas Harrington, my former husband, I leave 30% ownership of Harrington Systems and my beach property in Monterey, California. The silence that followed was absolute. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's impossible, he said sharply. There must be some mistake. Reed remained unruffled. There is no mistake, James. Your mother amended her will properly in my presence and that of 2 witnesses. She was of completely sound mind and very specific about her wishes. I sat frozen, certain I had misheard. 30% of a $35 million company. The beach house Margaret had purchased after our divorce. It made no sense. But why? The question came from Stephanie, who looked as shocked as her husband. They've been divorced for 15 years. They had no contact. Reed glanced at me, then back to James. Margaret included a letter explaining her decision. Would you like me to read it now, or would you prefer to review it privately? Read it, James demanded, still standing, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Reed nodded and opened a sealed envelope, extracting several pages of what I immediately recognized as Margaret's distinctive handwriting. To those present at the reading of my will, particularly my son James and my former husband William. Reed began reading. If this letter is being shared, then I have passed away without having the courage to have certain conversations in person, for which I am deeply sorry. I felt a tightness in my chest as Margaret's words filled the room, her voice almost palpable in the careful phrasing. The past year has forced me to reflect on my life in ways I had previously avoided. When confronted with my own mortality, I found myself reviewing not just business decisions, but personal ones as well. In doing so, I have come to recognize some painful truths about choices I made and the narratives I created to justify them. James slowly sat back down, his expression unreadable. William was not merely my husband for 25 years. He was instrumental in the founding and early success of what became Harrington Systems. His industry knowledge, contacts, and unwavering support made my vision possible. More importantly, while I pursued my ambitions, William ensured our son had the stable, loving home that allowed him to become the exceptional man he is today. I swallowed hard, unprepared for this acknowledgement, after so many years of feeling erased from the company's origin story. The truth I have avoided is that our divorce was driven not by incompatibility but by my own failings. I chose ambition over partnership, new excitement over enduring commitment, and then constructed a story that cast William as an obstacle rather than the foundation he had always been. I allowed this false narrative to influence James's perception of his father, something for which I cannot fully atone. The letter continued, detailing how Margaret had secretly followed my life after our divorce, aware of my volunteer work, my struggles, and my continued attempts to connect with James. She expressed regret for the role she had played in our estrangement and acknowledged the dignity with which I had handled the divorce despite its inequity. This bequest is not charity or guilt, but recognition of what should have been William's all along. 30% reflects a conservative estimate of his contribution to the company's foundation and success. The Monterey property is included because William always loved the ocean, a love our son inherited, and it is my hope that perhaps this shared appreciation might someday help rebuild what my actions helped destroy. As Reed finished reading, the room remained silent. I sat stunned, tears threatening despite my best efforts to maintain composure. The acknowledgement coming so late but so completely unlocked emotions I had carefully contained for 15 years. James stared at the table, his jaw working as if he were physically chewing on his mother's words. Stephanie had her hand on his arm, her expression a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like vindication. Reed folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. "There are, of course, legal documents detailing the exact terms of these bequests," he said, his professional manner returning. "We'll need signatures and we'll arrange for the transfer of titles and ownership certificates." James finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the reading began. I saw confusion there, anger, but also uncertainty, as if the ground beneath his carefully constructed understanding had suddenly shifted. "I'll be contesting this," he said flatly to Reed. The lawyer nodded, unsurprised. "That is your right, of course. However, I should inform you that your mother anticipated this reaction. The codicil is legally sound, witnessed not only by myself, but by Dr. Eleanor Chen, who conducted a full cognitive assessment at the time to establish your mother's mental capacity. Additionally, Margaret prepared extensive documentation supporting her statements regarding Mr. Harrington's contributions to the company's founding." James's expression hardened. "We'll see about that," he said, standing again and gathering his papers. "Stephanie, we're leaving." As they moved toward the door, I found my voice. "James, wait." To my surprise, he paused, turning back with reluctance. "There's nothing to discuss right now, Dad." "I understand you're shocked. So am I said gently. "But please don't leave like this. Whatever happens with the will, you're still my son." Something flickered in his eyes, a momentary softening before the corporate mask returned. "I'll have my lawyers contact you," he said, then walked out. Stephanie following after giving me an apologetic glance. As the others filed out, murmuring among themselves, Reed approached me. "Mr. Harrington, I know this is overwhelming. Take some time to process everything. My office will contact you next week to begin the formal procedures." I nodded, still dazed. Did she really mean it? About my contribution to the company? Reed's professional demeanor warmed slightly. "In the 30 years I knew Margaret, I never saw her do anything without complete conviction. And between us, in our private conversations these past months, her regret was genuine. She wanted to make amends in the only way she knew how." As I left the building and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt as if I were walking in a dream. Not because of the unexpected wealth, though, that was certainly shocking, but because after 15 years of feeling erased, Margaret had finally acknowledged our shared history and my contributions to both our family and her success. More importantly, she had opened a door, however complicated, to potentially rebuilding my relationship with James. Whether he would walk through that door remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, I felt a fragile hope taking root. The weeks following the will reading were a tumultuous blur of legal consultations, financial discussions, and emotional processing. As promised, James's attorneys contacted mine, initiating what threatened to be a protracted legal battle. Meanwhile, Reed's firm proceeded with the transfer of the Monterey property to my name and began the process of registering my 30% ownership in Harrington Systems. Throughout this period, I struggled to reconcile the practical implications of my unexpected inheritance with the emotional impact of Margaret's posthumous acknowledgement. The wealth itself was almost abstract numbers on documents that seemed disconnected from my daily life. But her words, her recognition of our shared history, and her role in separating me from my son, those cut deep in both painful and healing ways. 3 weeks after the reading, I received another surprise, a text message from Stephanie asking if I would meet her for coffee without James's knowledge. Curious and hopeful this might provide insight into my son's state of mind, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe far from both the company headquarters and James's home. Stephanie looked tired but determined as she slid into the booth across from me. "James doesn't know I'm here," she confirmed after we'd ordered. "He's been struggling since the reading. I thought maybe if I understood your perspective better, I might help him process everything." "I appreciate that," I said sincerely. "How is he really?" Stephanie sighed. "Angry, confused, hurt. He built his entire adult identity around his mother's version of your family history. Now he's questioning everything, including himself." She hesitated, then continued more softly. "The thing is, even before Margaret died, I had questions. The way James talked about you didn't match the man I eventually met at the funeral, and there were inconsistencies in Margaret's stories over the years." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Small things at first. She'd mention a family vacation where you taught James to surf, then later claim you were never interested in family activities. Or she'd reference your renovation of their first office space, then in another conversation suggest you'd been unsupportive of her business." I nodded, unsurprised. Margaret was brilliant at crafting narratives that served her current needs. "James doesn't want to fight with you," Stephanie said suddenly. "Not really. He's scared. The company has been his entire focus since college. The thought of sharing control, of having to collaborate with you after all these years of separation, it terrifies him." This insight into my son's thoughts was invaluable. "I don't want to take anything away from him," I assured her. "James has clearly done amazing things with the company. I have no desire to interfere with that." "Would you consider giving up your shares?" she asked directly. I considered her question carefully. "No," I finally answered. "Not because of the money, but because this may be my only chance to rebuild a relationship with my son. If I simply sign everything over, James will have no reason to ever speak to me again." Stephanie studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "I thought you might say that. And honestly, I think you're right. James needs to confront this situation, not have it resolved for him." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "This is James's private cell number. He changes it regularly for security reasons, so few people have it. Call him tomorrow evening around 8. He'll be home and I'll make sure he answers." I took the card, touched by her unexpected alliance. "Thank you, Stephanie. May I ask why you're doing this?" She smiled slightly. "James is a wonderful man, but he carries wounds he doesn't fully understand. I've watched him drive himself relentlessly, always seeking his mother's approval, even when she was no longer actively running the company." She paused. "And maybe selfishly, I want any children we might have to know both their grandfathers." The mention of potential grandchildren caught me off guard, filling me with a longing I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. "I would like that very much," I said softly. The following evening, I stared at my phone for nearly 20 minutes before finally dialing James's number. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice guarded when I identified myself. "Stephanie gave you this number," he said. It wasn't a question. "She's concerned about you," I replied. "About us." A long silence followed. "My lawyers advised me not to speak with you directly while the will is being contested. I'm not calling as a shareholder, James. I'm calling as your father." Another silence, then a tired sigh. "What do you want, Dad?" The simple use of Dad rather than my name gave me courage to continue. "I want to talk. Not about the will or the company, but about us. About clearing the air after all these years." "There's nothing to discuss," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Mom explained her perspective in the letter. That was her perspective," I pointed out gently. "But there are 3 sides to this story. Hers, mine, and somewhere in between the truth. Don't you want to know that truth?" When he didn't immediately reject the idea, I pressed on. "I'm not looking to fight you for control of the company, James. You've built something remarkable there, and I have no desire to interfere with that. But I would like the chance to be part of your life again in whatever capacity you're comfortable with." "And the 30% ownership?" he asked pointedly. "We can figure that out together," I offered. "As family, not adversaries." The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, James spoke, his voice less certain than before. "I can meet Saturday morning. There's a coffee shop near the old house, the one where we used to get breakfast when Mom was traveling." My heart leapt at this small acknowledgement of our shared past. "Donovan's on Maple Street. It's called something brewing now, but yes, same place, 9 o'clock. I'll be there," I promised. Saturday arrived with a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. I arrived early, choosing a corner table that offered some privacy. The cafe had been renovated since our days as regular customers, but the large windows overlooking the neighborhood park remained sunlight streaming through them, just as I remembered. James arrived precisely at 9, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater rather than his usual business attire. The informality seemed significant, a subtle step away from the corporate persona he had maintained in all our recent interactions. Our initial conversation was awkward, filled with careful small talk about the weather, the cafe's changes, neutral topics that allowed us to adjust to each other's presence. Gradually, however, the discussion shifted to more substantial ground. "I've been thinking about what Mom wrote," James finally said, cradling his second cup of coffee, "about her role in our estrangement." I nodded, giving him space to continue. "The thing is, I have these memories of you from when I was young. Good memories. But somewhere along the way they got overshadowed by this other narrative, this idea that you were holding Mom back, that you were jealous of her success." "I never was," I said quietly. "I was incredibly proud of what she built." James studied me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time in years. "I believe you," he said, sounding almost surprised at his own conclusion. "Which means I've been wrong about a lot of things for a very long time." That admission opened a floodgate. For the next 2 hours, we talked more honestly than we had in decades. I shared my perspective on the marriage and divorce without vilifying Margaret, acknowledging both her brilliance and the ways her ambition had shaped our family dynamics. James spoke of the pressure he had felt growing up as her son, the constant expectation of excellence, and how that pressure had intensified after the divorce when he became her primary emotional focus. "She needed me to choose her," he confessed. "Not explicitly, but the expectation was always there. If I showed too much interest in spending time with you, she would become withdrawn, worried. Eventually, it was easier to align myself completely with her world." "I never wanted you to have to choose," I told him. "I just wanted to remain your father." "I know that now," he said, regret coloring his voice. "But back then it seemed like the only way to keep my relationship with Mom stable was to accept her version of everything." As our conversation continued, I sensed a gradual lowering of the walls James had maintained for so long. We didn't resolve everything in that one meeting, nor did we directly address the inheritance issue, but we established something crucial: a willingness to listen to each other, to consider perspectives beyond the narratives we had each constructed or accepted. When we finally parted, James hesitated, then extended his hand. I took it, but then gently pulled him into an embrace. After a moment of surprise, he returned the hug briefly but genuinely. "Stephanie and I usually have dinner at home on Thursdays," he said as we walked toward our cars. "Nothing fancy. Maybe you could join us next week." "I'd like that very much," I replied, working to keep my voice steady despite the emotion welling within me. Over the following weeks, these family dinners became regular occurrences. Sometimes we discussed business with James, explaining the company's current projects and challenges. Other times, we simply shared meals and conversation, gradually rebuilding the connection we had lost. Stephanie proved an invaluable ally in this process, often gently steering conversations when they threatened to become tense, or creating space for James and me to discuss difficult topics. 2 months after our first coffee meeting, James invited me to tour the company headquarters. Walking through the sleek modern offices of Harrington Systems was surreal, seeing the empire that had grown from the small startup Margaret and I had once discussed at our dining table. "We're planning to establish a scholarship foundation," James explained as we stood in the conference room overlooking the Boston skyline, "for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds interested in technology and construction." "Your mother would have approved," I said. "Actually," James replied, "I was hoping we might name it after both of you, the Harrington Family Foundation, recognizing both the founders." The significance of this gesture, this public acknowledgement of my role in the company's origin story, brought tears to my eyes that I didn't try to hide. "I would be honored," I said simply. That afternoon, after months of legal negotiations, we finally addressed the inheritance directly. James had withdrawn his contest of the will, accepting Margaret's decision, but remained concerned about how my ownership might affect company operations. "I'm not interested in day-to-day management," I assured him. "You've proven yourself more than capable as CEO, but I would like to contribute in some capacity, perhaps in an advisory role related to construction industry trends or mentoring young engineers." James considered this, then nodded. "The board has a quarterly meeting next month. I think it's time I introduced you formally as both a major shareholder and a founding influence." We also discussed the Monterey beach house which I had visited once since inheriting it. "It's beautiful," I told him, "but too large for just me. I was thinking it might make a nice family vacation home for all of us to use." The "all of us" hung in the air between us, its meaning clear. A month earlier, Stephanie had shared the news that she was pregnant. The prospect of becoming a grandfather had filled me with joy I couldn't adequately express. "We could spend summers there together," James suggested tentatively. "Once the baby is old enough to travel, teach him or her to swim like you taught me." "I would love nothing more," I said, marveling at how far we had come in such a relatively short time. 1 year after Margaret's passing, we gathered at the beach house in Monterey. James and Stephanie, with their 2-month-old daughter Eleanor William Harrington, named to honor both her grandmothers and me. As I stood on the deck overlooking the Pacific, my granddaughter sleeping peacefully in my arms, I reflected on the unpredictable journey that had brought us to this moment. Margaret's final act had been to acknowledge a truth long buried, that relationships matter more than success, that the stories we tell ourselves and others shape our reality, and that it's never too late to correct a wrong, even if that correction must come from beyond the grave. As I watched James approach so much like his mother in his confidence, but with a gentleness that was uniquely his own, I realized that the true inheritance Margaret had left wasn't the money or property, but this second chance at family, at healing. "She's perfect," James said, gazing at his daughter with wonder. "I want to do better for her than was done for me. No false narratives, no forced choices." "You already are doing better," I assured him, "by simply being willing to question the story you were given and find your own truth." That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I found myself filled with a profound gratitude, not just for the material wealth that had unexpectedly come my way, but for the far greater riches of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the precious gift of family restored. The true value of Margaret's will wasn't measured in the millions listed on paper, but in the priceless opportunity it created for healing and new beginnings. In that sense, both James and I had received an inheritance beyond price. If you have experienced family estrangement or painful separations in your own life, I hope my story offers some measure of hope. Sometimes healing comes from unexpected places, and it is never too late for reconciliation. Please share your own stories in the comments below. Subscribe to hear more journeys of family healing, and remember that even the deepest wounds can eventually become scars that tell a story of survival and renewal. Thank you for listening, and may you find peace in your own family story, whatever shape it may take.